Our guest is Robin Marsh, Secretary General in the United Kingdom for the Universal Peace Federation. With Robin, we will be discussing the issue of United Nations reform. We will be discussing the issue of sexual violence in conflict zones. And we will be discussing the question of whether humanity can become one family under God. Welcome to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. Our guest today is Robin Marsh. He's Secretary General in the UK of the Universal Peace Federation. It's a real joy to have him here. With Robin, we will be discussing the issue of United Nations reform, the issue of sexual violence in conflict, and the issue of the relationship between God and humanity, the likes of you and me, in other words. Three very critical issues, very interesting issues for us. Robin, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you for being with us here on you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, bless you. Well, what we'll do, we'll go to a short video clip, if we may, which kind of sets the scene for our readers, and it's our habit anyway at the moment, and then we'll get down to our discussion.
Okay.
Wherever there is conflict and war, there is sexual violence. According to the United Nations, sexual violence can refer to many different crimes, including rape, sexual humiliation, forced prostitution, and forced pregnancy. Victims can be of any age. This perennial problem, until recently, was considered an inevitable byproduct of armed conflict and thus deemed not worthy of special attention. However, there has been a growing awareness of sexual violence. Last year, a global summit was held in London to end sexual violence, attended by the former Foreign Secretary of Britain, William Hague, and Angelina Jolie, the actress who is a special envoy for the UN High Commissioner of Refugees. Sexual violence remains a key weapon of war in the 21st century, and if left unaddressed, can be used as a means of continuing acts of war outside the purview of monitoring teams, and can trigger cycles of vengeance and undermine confidence in any mediation process. The Universal Peace Federation believes in the concept of one family under God as a means of countering radicalization and extremism and fostering human rights. With the rise of a globally interconnected world, issues of religion have come front and center. Misunderstandings between religion and extremist forms of religion have flared in the current world climate. The similar roots and ties between the three monotheistic faiths of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism mean that much can be attained if interfaith dialogue is fostered and encouraged actively in today's society. If people of different faiths can unite together and understand each other, it would be much harder for radicalization and extremism to take root. So, Robin, thank you again. Our first subject is the United Nations, or at least it's the work of the objective of the Universal Peace Federation in relation to the UN. So maybe let's take one step back before we talk about the UN and what you want to do. Tell us what the ethos of the Universal Peace Federation is and where you're coming from with this.
So just to briefly introduce the Universal Peace Federation, it was founded in 2005. And it was founded by Reverend Dr. Sam Young-moon and his wife. And it was founded with two slogans in mind. One was that we are one family under God. Humanity is one family under God. And two is that we should live for the sake of others. And one of its founding purposes was to bring interfaith dialogue into the arena of the United Nations, so that it could be a way of interreligious dialogue to enhance mutual understanding, to allow a different perspective based on scriptural wisdom, also philosophical wisdom, to come into the decision-making process.
And this is exactly what we want to discuss first. So, for what purpose? I mean, you want this concept to be brought into the workings, the thinking of the United Nations. To what purpose? You're talking of the need for UN reform, or is that the reform you want to see? The mere inclusion of a spiritual dynamic in UN debate, or?
I think there are many types of reform, and I don't think that Universal Peace Federation was coming in with a whole description of how it should be reformed. But this particular aspect they wanted to bring in, which was something that was lacking in 1948, when communism and democracy was facing off against each other. You couldn't have a world together in the UN body in that situation and have got in the Constitution of the United Nations. So this time he wanted to bring this different element into the deliberations of the UN. Politicians come representing their nations with their national self-interest, but they're accountable to their electorates. But religious leaders, they're accountable to their conscience and their faith and their perception of God's will. And if they have a genuine experience of God, they should be concerned about other religions, about other regions of the world, about the peace and well-being of the whole world, not just their own religion and faith.
The thing that religious leaders tend to do is criticize the other. So there is this tendency. I mean, Tolstoy said, the cruelest thing one man can say to another in terms of his religious belief is to say, I am right and you are wrong. But that seems to be what religious leaders are doing, and they're rarely speaking up. I mean, there are one or two exceptions. You could say the Dalai Lama, or there are figures that do speak up for peace and reconciliation. But by and large, the religious leaders of the world are failing to stand up for honest governance, failing to lead, and we have a war-riven world, really, particularly a war-riven Middle East, in which you could argue religion is part of the problem rather than part of the answer. I mean, but your perspective is you feel that the religious leaders can be part of the answer.
They can be part of the answer. If those genuinely experiencing God within them can appreciate the other and to value the other as another child of God. So if the world is considered as a whole by this religious body, then it will have a powerful influence on the political decision-making of the political decision-making General Assembly and the Security Council. So what we would need is religious representatives who have a foundation of respect, who are genuine people who guide their leaders.
In the, I mean, to be where? You want to establish some sort of rapprochement between religious leaders meeting in caucus and the United Nations.
Within the United Nations structure, that there can be a place for dialogue, for discussion, for mutual understanding. And maybe first of all, as you said, it wouldn't work and there would be conflicts but I think the world has moved on a lot, and there are many bodies already that are practicing good interfaith relations.
Because, I mean, interfaith relations tends to be, those that are practicing it tend to do so quite weakly. They look for points in common. They seem to rarely deal with the hard issues. I mean, the hard issues for interfaith dialogue. Moral standards in war. Is an Israeli settler a soldier, or is he a settler? How do you treat that person? Are cluster bombs illegal? Are mines illegal? Are drones fair weapons of war? Is it right for Islam to fight Islam, Shiite to fight Sunni, or is that dishonourable because we have at the moment a civil war in Islam? You know, these kinds of issues, these major issues, these cogent issues, weapons of mass destruction, are they right? Are they permissible? Are they not permissible? The religious leaders aren't really, and I say that in a world in which many of the states of the Middle East have not signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, and many of them may have signed but not ratified the Nuclear Weapons Convention. You know, you had, let alone the Biological Weapons Convention, we have a situation in which we have nations that are torn apart by brutal violence, and the religious leaders, much of this is done in the name of religion. The religious leaders are not really speaking out. I mean, wouldn't you say?
They're not speaking out sufficiently. I would agree, and it needs religious leadership to come up. And there are very good religious leaders in many of those countries that are at war. It needs for them to speak up and take the mantle of leadership, and to reflect upon their own responsibility to their maker, to their faith, and then act with that as the basis. On that, with that dynamic, there can be rapprochement between those type of religious leaders. They can be the ones who can take a lead and then inspire and shame and guide, admonish others to follow them.
I'd love to see it. I mean, it's not been a feature of today's world that religious leaders stand up to be counted. I mean, they are by and large pathetic. I am quite impressed by the Pope, the new Pope, because he's come out strongly about issues with regard to the world and the protection of the world's environment. But it's a rarity.
It's too weak. It's true, and it needs to be impassioned. It needs to have power behind it, but it needs also an alliance with civil society. That religious voice and civil society need to work together to hold their governments to account and to take that leadership. People like His Holiness the Pope, Desmond Tutu. I probably also, you know very well, Bishop Ria Abu al-Assal. Many times these people would stand up and speak out, even when it was very uncomfortable. And there are many other religious leaders who can and do speak up, but they need more support, and they need that support. And I think those kind of leaders within having a position within the United Nations would have an enhanced position to be able to speak. The idea of the World Interfaith Harmony Week, which was declared by the United Nations for, I think it's the first week of February, and with the influence of the King of Jordan. These kinds of initiatives are building up. In the Philippines, it was Senator De Venecia. He was pushing for more and more interfaith dialogue within the United Nations. And for over 10 years, it's moved quite a long way.
It's interesting. Jordan has been very good in terms of bringing people together. It's a rare exception, and as a nation, they have been very good at dialogue. But where do we go? I mean, this is obviously for a purpose. You're talking about the need for UN reform, not just for the sake of reform. You're talking about it because you want a more peaceful world.
Because we want a more peaceful world, because there needs to be a consciousness of the whole world. Already humankind there are very positive things going on in the world, as well as very negative things. So Sustainable Development Goals, coming on from Millennium Development Goals. Nowhere in human history did everyone ever have the opportunity or even the consciousness of having Millennium Development Goals.
Yeah, I don't think our readers will even, our listeners will even understand what you're talking about, because these are very Western Well, they may do, but I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about. Let's put it that way. People throw out these phrases, sustainable development. It means nothing to me. I mean, what do you mean by that?
For people to lay down a benchmark of where humanity as a whole should be in 15 years' time.
Who's laid down a
So,
benchmark?
so the United Nations in 2000 laid down a benchmark by 2015 that many goals should be fulfilled of tackling poverty, of tackling infant mortality, of maternal health, of education, of cooperation and partnership between many groups. Those benchmarks are set up and goals are set up, but they were like low-hanging fruit. They were the things that could be accomplished. Now there's another 15-year plan, the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be rolled out by the end of this year. And these are to go from 2015 to 2030. Nowhere in history did mankind ever have the opportunity or consciousness of doing this, where you're trying to enhance the development of countries all over the world and showing pathways.
It's like the old communist 10-year plans or whatever. I mean, they're all very well if they get us anywhere. If I say there's a goal to eradicate illiteracy in the world by 2025 or something, it's pretty meaningless if there's more illiteracy in the world in 2025 than there is now. And we are certainly in a war where there is more war than there was 10 years ago, where there is more human suffering than there was 10 years ago, probably where there's massively more unemployment than there was 10 years ago, so and massively less democracy than there was 10 years ago. So the goals may be there, but we are not improving as a world. I mean, you just have to look at the world we live in.
Recently, there was a Global Peace Index. It's been going since 2008, and it was the 2014 was launched about 2 weeks ago, and it does show that there is more conflict, but it has a number of interesting dynamics within many of the countries because of the way it measures peace. It doesn't mention violence between nations, but also mentions suicide rates, homicide rates, and many other different factors. But it shows that in many ways humanity is getting better, even though there are areas where there's greater conflict. As a whole, it is actually going in a much better direction. So what I'm trying to say is there are many positive things going on, and we need to take a broad brush and a long-term perspective. There are areas in which we need to insert a lot of wisdom. As you were saying, the conflict now is rising up between Russia and NATO, China and the South China Sea, those areas,
absolutely.
the Middle East. There are areas where we need greater wisdom. And for that wisdom, I think the religious leaders need to stand up. We need to call for them to stand up and take their own position, where they can be inspired by God and say, like the prophets of old, speak when they see something that's wrong, and get people to follow them. If they are really, truly heart-moving and spiritual people, they will be followed. People will be looking for answers, particularly when in front of them is a lot of difficulties.
I don't disagree with it that they would be followed. What the difficulty I find is that for them to speak, I think that they are not, by and large, inspired or inspiring men and women. And we don't see leadership from our religious leaders. This is the great tragedy one of the great tragedies of the world today. Perhaps other than the prophets, we never did. Maybe religious leaders, the priests and the imams of the world, have always been weak through history, and it is the great prophets that have led us. I would love to see priests, imams, and rabbis, and the great leaders and thinkers taking a major stand.
If I could give one example, one example is the role of forgiveness and reconciliation. There are many structures in traditional cultures, cultural rules to prevent revenge. In the Middle East, in Africa, there are many systems to prevent the ongoing cycle of revenge. But to promote forgiveness, that is particularly something that can be inspired by religious leaders. And when they have taken that role of leading their people to forgiveness, they can have a powerful impact beyond their culture, beyond their nation. And that would give hope. That would give a lot of hope. And I think, not particularly because they're a religious group, but the role of the Bereaved Family Forum was quite amazing, when you could see people in Israel,
in regard to Israel and Palestine,
where a grieving Palestinian who's paid the price of the conflict, a grieving Israeli who's paid the price of the conflict by losing a close family member, then rather than taking this way of revenge to get this bitterness out of their system, they instead went as couples, as a pair, to a synagogue, to an Israeli school, to a Palestinian school, to speak to teenagers. These examples are truly remarkable, but we need the religious voice to enhance them, to support them, to encourage them in a way of healing the world. Father Moon, because he founded the Universal Peace Federation, he was almost killed by Kim Il-sung in North Korea. He was put in a prison camp under President Kim Il-sung's regime. After almost dying in that prison camp after 3 years, he was released, went to the south, spent the next 40 years building up a foundation to go back. And he went back with machine tool factories, with culture, with tourist industry, many different ideas to help the North Korean people. So he came back with something which could move the heart of the North Korean leadership. And Kim Il-sung and Reverend Moon, they came together and said, blood is thicker than water. They hugged each other. And from that point on, there's been a dynastic relationship, which in a sense shows a way of forgiveness, and has been a way of avoiding a number of conflicts, preventing a number of conflicts with North Korea and others.
Forgiveness is a powerful tool. It's one none of us like. We don't like to practice it ourselves. We're so into resentment when we are hurt. I talk from personal experience. I mean, somebody hurts me, I want to lash out at them. And international affairs are reactive in that sense. Something happens, we lash out against it, and wars are on that basis. Yes, it would be good to see a little forgiveness in world affairs.
Because that forgiveness brings hope to mankind. The Marshall Plan, for example, was quite an incredible stance.
That's the post-World War,
post-Second World War, rebuilding Germany, rebuilding most of Europe. And it came in a certain context, but that was remarkable if you compare it to the end of the First World War. Again, this realm of religion has wisdom that is needed within the political sphere.
Interesting. Let's move on. I mean, we can come back to this subject, but let's move on for the moment. We had a second subject on our agenda for today, which was, well, it is directly related, but it's rather the antithesis of what we've been talking about. It's sexual violence in conflict, and it's, well, it's a disturbing and distressing subject. We are seeing the sale of Yazidi women as slaves. We're seeing the use of in Africa as rape as a weapon of war.
In Bosnia.
Yes, I mean sexual violence in conflict is actually very much a feature of conflict, isn't it?
And Libya.
Yes.
There are many terrible examples, and because of its severe communal and family generational consequences, the revenge continues generation after generation. The woman who is raped in Libya during the revolution, some of them I heard couldn't go home. They had to go to Tunisia because of the shame that that brought to their family. But the revenge that came from that to other communities, communities who were supposed to have done it, is again, it's going on a secular basis. So this initiative of William Hague and Angelina Jolie Pitt last year in London, and supported by the United Nations and Zainab Hawa Bengura, then these people, they brought a new initiative to tackle this issue. But it's something, it's very personal for communities, but particularly as you mentioned in Africa. I have a close friend who I often partnership with because she's seen the consequences of this. She brought one lady to our office one day who had been raped and had gone through this in Eastern Congo. And it's a lifelong trauma. It's something which affects the family.
But
and it's used for ethnic cleansing.
How do we deal with it? I mean, it's been highlighted, highlighted repeatedly recently, as you rightly say. William Hague had a very famous, well-documented conference here in the UK on the subject. In civil wars and so forth, how do we reduce sexual violence? By reducing the war. I mean, it's a feature of war, isn't it?
It has been a feature of war in the past. In World War II, there was a huge amount of rape in Europe. So it's, again, human consciousness is, I believe, I'm in that sense optimistic. In many places of the world, human consciousness is expanding, is growing. Therefore, it is a good time to tackle such an issue. They've highlighted this issue as a campaign, and that then requires member states of the United Nations to focus on that campaign. And I've just been reading the United Kingdom has been training Peshmerga forces to be sensitive to this issue, has been training forces in DRC and in Somalia on this issue. The Universal Peace Federation here in the UK, we've had a series of events about this issue, mainly because of our partners, our friends, who have been through it, and therefore they wanted to highlight it, and we gave them a platform. But I think it's an important issue to highlight because it's such a severe weapon of ethnic cleansing, of breaking down communities, of this cyclical revenge that will go on for generations because of the women who are born with children of the rapist.
Yes, it's a particular feature, I would say, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a particular feature of civil wars, this sexual violence. And, of course, the civil wars are the most brutal. They're the wars in which, as a general rule, prisoners are not taken, but all prisoners are executed. For example, by and large in Syria, Iraq, and I know the Kurds have just started to take prisoners. But by and large, in civil wars, Libya initially, prisoners are executed, not imprisoned. Sexual violence is not uncommon, and the ethnic cleansing of people from their homes, either by bombing or collaterally or whatever, is commonplace.
It's, in a sense, there's a stage worse in some settings where there is public systematic rape in front of the community, and I'm talking now of Eastern Congo, in order to break the community, to break the family.
Who's
the husband and
responsible
wife
for
can't look at each other afterwards. Particularly these militia in the lawless area of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo.
that? Yes.
They want the people to move out so that they can take over the land and the mining in these areas.
Horrifying situation. I mean, it is so repugnant. It's almost too horrible to talk about.
This is the area where we need to challenge impunity and to be able to take people to the court in The Hague or to have courts
but
which
is that the
can
answer?
deal with
I mean,
it.
the International Criminal Court in The Hague has so often been part of the problem. You look at its indictment of President Bashir of Sudan. I'm trying to pronounce that exactly because I don't mean Bashar of Syria, but Bashir of Sudan, which has set peace and reconciliation back in the Sudan.
Right.
Because he's a serving president and he therefore says, well, there you go. What does it matter? What's the point? So, and they have similarly indicted one of the governors of one of the disputed areas in Sudan is also indicted for war crimes, and he is the elected governor of that area, and he too, I think, is less accountable, more brutal, because of the International Criminal Court. Because again, he thinks, okay, so what's the point? Does this? I often think that we need more of a truth and reconciliation approach, the South African Nelson Mandela approach, rather than the International Criminal Court, which is so confrontational and is certainly not about forgiveness. Your whole thought was forgiveness. The earlier strand of your, but interesting.
In a sense, some of the people who have been sent to The Hague were these militia leaders from Eastern Congo. Some of the successes that they've had. But in this kind of lawless area where there has been mass rape with impunity, then somehow if you can't impose a judicial system or a legal system and a rule of law in which people can live, then somehow there needs to be intermediary steps until that good governance can be established.
Interesting. So, and that is the mechanism for dealing with this. There is none other, I suppose, is there? I mean, when you have civil wars, how can you? You can only deal with it by threat of reprisal or retribution to these people that are conducting this kind of thing.
The sense of the world becoming very small for people who commit egregious acts of violence against civilians, against women, during wartime, the fact that they can't leave their area for fear of being arrested, I think is some small deterrent.
Okay, well, that's an interesting thought. So it's an area that we need to highlight. It's something that the International Criminal Court is there as a kind of a stick to beat people with. There is no carrot. There's no way of trying to reduce this violence any other way, is there? There's no.
There have been a number of initiatives made of educating young men to respect women, or to create systems of support for women, to prevent women going out to the field on their own, to farm. There are a number of initiatives that have been made, but in these lawless areas it's very, very difficult to really protect. And the UN forces in Eastern Congo haven't been very successful at protecting civilians.
And in much of Africa and the Middle East is lawless, I suppose. Areas of Iraq, Syria,
yes,
Yemen, and I mean, rape as a weapon of war. is less common in these areas, but there is the issue of there's certainly the issue of the taking of women as slaves by ISIS. It's the most extraordinary business. A disturbing subject you brought to our attention. Let's move on to our final thought, the final topic we need to talk about.
Yes.
Before we go to our little book review at the end, but let's move on to our final topic, and which was a curious one, but perhaps a more heartening one, a more uplifting one. The relationship between God and humanity, and indeed your thought that we need to be more of a family. Explain this to me.
So, human consciousness of other people in other areas of the world, in the past maybe has been more limited because of lack of travel, lack of communications. Now, there's a much greater understanding of humanity. News from many parts of the world can come immediately through Twitter, through YouTube, through news feeds. You can tailor the news you want to get from different parts of the world very, very simply. My sense is, what is our responsibility as a human being? As a religious person, we've heard of this idea of sins of omission and sins of commission. So sins of commission are things that you do, you physically do, that are wrong, according to religious view. Sins of omission are things that you're not so aware of. So if our shirts are being made in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh a few years ago, we didn't know that the suffering of the people that were sewing those shirts.
In the sweatshirts, yes.
And then when that Rana Plaza collapsed, because health and safety hadn't been taken care of, the building hadn't been maintained so well, the working standards of people hadn't been observed and maintained, we were somehow complicit because we bought their shirts. We pushed different companies to force down the price, not knowing what people were going through to make those. When we look at our mobile phones, I need to take our mobile phones, we didn't know that many of the minerals that come from the Congo, for example, were from areas where human rights were being abused.
I mean, you cannot. We can, I suppose. We could only consume ethically produced goods.
With effort.
You might.
With time and with effort and with campaigning, with consumer influence, we're moving in that direction. But it's taking an effort. But people are now highlighting a fair phone, for example, which doesn't come from areas where there is rape or murder based on militias.
You can drive those areas back into further economic decline by doing this, presumably.
That's also, it has to be done very wisely. So, for example, some companies have, they've developed a system which is protected. The mine is protected. The miners then get 3 times the value for their minerals. They can pay more money to their communities. So there are these systems, whether it's clothes or others, but the supply chain and how people are treated in that supply chain is the child labor.
And this is what you mean by a relationship between the human family and God? I mean, you're saying that we need to think of ourselves, humanity needs to think of itself as one family, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yes, that we have common responsibility to people in different parts of the world.
So that those people who are making T-shirts in Bangladesh on exploited labor, we think of them as our brothers and sisters, and we regard them as equals, is what you mean.
we endeavour to help them by asking our companies to treat them well. The United Nations has come up with business human rights, for example, which a number of countries have signed up to, and there are guiding principles on supply chains. Which
I mean, there's this translate anywhere beyond the economic issue? Or is it just an economic question?
I think it translates also into child soldiers and many different areas, but it's
What is
a
a
much
child
less.
soldier, by the way? I mean, well, I say this because many of our viewers are in countries in civil war. What is a child soldier? If you're in a Kurdish village and you pick up a gun to help defend your family from
Yeah.
ISIS, and you're 14 years old, are you a child soldier? I mean, what is it? What are we talking about when we say child soldiers?
Yes.
It's a very subjective statement,
It is.
isn't it?
It is, and there are many issues involved in that. Mainly, in different parts of the world, there are militias which abduct children, a little bit like Boko Haram taking the women in Nigeria. Those women, some of them have fought for Boko Haram, and I think some of those in areas in Iraq or Syria.
Well, we do have child soldiers in Syria. But I know that because I've seen the videos of young children fighting for ISIS, training to fight with ISIS. Now, presumably, that is not a question, or it may be, but one has to make the assumption that they are people who have volunteered, and they may be 13, 14 years old. They volunteered of their own free will with their family's consent. In that situation, I would say that was wrong. I think you would say that was wrong. But what do we do? I mean, do we draw some line at the age of 13 and say somebody who chooses to pick up a gun under the age of 13 should not do so, and we should not, I mean...
Maybe there should be a lack of compulsion, that children under a certain age should not be compelled to fight. And with the long term in mind, that somehow children need to take the time for education,
I would hope
for
nobody
future
was compelled
development.
to fight, but we do get situations in which they
of
are.
course.
I mean, it's...
There are other issues, like migrants, for example, that we have to think as Europeans, this view of so many people coming from Syria, through Turkey, coming to Greece, and landing on beaches with holidaymakers. You see the contradiction of one group of people having maybe quite a fortunate life, another having a very unfortunate life. Somehow we can't be like a fortress Europe enjoying our prosperity when so many people in different parts of the world are are suffering so much.
Well, you
and
say that, but
able to take care of their families.
I mean, I see your sense of one world and the need for... I mean, Khalil Gibran used to believe in a world without frontiers. He's a great Lebanese poet and espoused that idea. But we're living in a nation, Britain, here, which has had net immigration of nearly 500,000 in the past year. And this is likely to go on. The Europe as a whole is, because, and you could say it's our fault, because of the mess that we've left Libya in, the numbers of refugees coming across the Mediterranean are huge. So what do? You say Fortress Europe is wrong, therefore we should absorb all these refugees?
I think the having 0.7 of 1% of the gross national income of the country, of the UK, given to overseas development, overseas aid, is a very good standard. That was a commitment made by many European countries. The UK is now fulfilling it, and that's something which has cross-party support, though we have to watch out how it's used. Encouraging other countries to do the same would be very good within Europe, but taking some responsibility for the neighbours around Europe's borders to help raise their living standard, to help encourage their business, through partnership. There are many things that if we developed in partnership with those neighbours, and there was a Euromed program,
Yes.
but enhancing that to develop the lifestyles of the young populations of the Maghreb of Africa or different and other parts of Africa. Eritrea now is suffering greatly, and so many people from Eritrea are coming to Europe.
Just to touch on this, because it's just an interests me anyway. I mean, Syria, for example, Sweden has opened its borders to all Syrian refugees without distinction.
Yes.
In that case, in regard to Syria. So any Syrian, if they can get to Sweden, can claim refuge. And there's no problem at all. They'll welcome any Syrian refugee. And they've got economic difficulties because of it. It's a very costly program, but they are implementing it. Unlike Britain, for example, that has only accommodated a couple of hundred Syrian refugees, though it has got net immigration of nearly 500,000. That's largely East Europeans coming here under the common market rules and others. But what I'm trying to say, in my clumsy way, is: do you, Robin Marsh, believe in a world without frontiers? Is this what you're saying? In the free movement of peoples?
I know that was Father Moon's understanding and feeling is your birds have no borders.
Right.
But we can't just move there immediately. We need to move there over time. But more
I like
is
that
what
expression, birds have no borders.
that's exactly what he said.
Yeah.
But what I like is the idea of partnership with different countries by enhancing their economies, by helping them to develop well. Those countries can also help us. So helping Libya, for example, we could have amazing solar panel farms in many
Libya
parts
needs
of...
rather more basic... Libya needs an end to war rather than solar panel farms, but
The
yes.
solar panel farms in the Sahara, in so many areas of Libya, connected to southern Italy. We wouldn't need gas from Russia, for example, if that's become an issue.
That would be a lovely...
So there are many areas where we can make partnerships with countries by investing in them more, by investing in their human development, not just using them for natural resources, but helping them to develop their countries and develop their economies.
Well, bless you. If there's one thing I will take away from this interview, this discussion, which has been most enlightening, is the thought that birds have no borders. I quite like that. Anyway, we're going to pause because our time is running out on us, but we're going to come to our book review. But thank you for being our guest on.
It's my pleasure. Yes, thank you.
Here we have it, your book, your choice of book, World Scripture, a comparative anthology of sacred texts. This is available in hardback and in paperback. This is a paperback version. So it's a huge tome. I am familiar with it. It's one I've seen before, and I must say, I could recommend this one. It's actually, I'm glad you brought it here. Paragon is the publisher. My eyesight is so bad, I'm going to have to find my glasses. But Paragon is the publisher. It has some wonderful... It's an anthology, as it calls itself, an anthology. It is an anthology with quotes from the Quran and from the Bible, I mean the Christian New Testament, the Jewish Old Testament.
So it takes one aspect of faith, and then gives different quotes from different faiths about it, from different religious backgrounds. And it's excellent for interfaith meetings, for contemplation. But, once I met Ninian Smart, who's one of the editors. Ninian Smart promoted the religious studies departments within the UK universities. He was an amazing man. If more men like him, we would have a world of peace. But amazingly wise and wonderful man. But, he promoted this with Dr. Andrew Wilson. And the sense you can get from that is actually there's not so much difference between the different religions. There are faith statements, of course, but 80% of most religions are in common, which comes as, I remember Reverend Clinton Bennett, who was a Methodist minister, who came up with this idea of being a virtual insider of another faith, to actually practice the tenets of another faith, worship with another faith, to celebrate with another faith, and to experience God through practicing that other faith, and to hold it in common, to experience together. That kind of person, that kind of practice is very possible through this kind of book.
It is wonderful. It is actually a wonderful book. And if I could but find I have found my glasses, I would read I mean, some of it selects passages from Islam, and then it has has similar passages from other religions, and they are just lovely, just quite lovely. I'm looking for a passage from the Quran that I mean it should be, for instance, the hadith of An Nawawi, that there be no injury and no requital. A beautiful idea, which is very much in the turn the other cheek concept of forgiveness that you have highlighted. And then it gives us passages from other faiths that are along the same line. Christianity, Matthew 5, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, resist not evil, turn the other cheek. I mean, hard to do, actually, in a situation where people are suffering violence. And Judaism from the Talmud, those who are insulted but do not insult others in revenge are as the sun when he goeth forth in his might. They're just beautiful little phrases, beautiful little passages, many of them from hadiths and from the Quran, but equally many of them from other books. I love this. I do think it is outstanding. It's an outstanding book. It's a pretty heavy book, but it's lovely to dip into. I don't think you could read it from cover to cover. You'd be lost. Well, you wouldn't be lost, but it would be, it's too much to read. You'd have to read a page a day or something.
And there is now also a volume 2.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Which you can find online.
Wow. Well, a wonderful book. Thank you for bringing it to our attention, to the attention of our listeners. The World Scripture, it's called, a comparative anthology of sacred texts, and published by Paragon House. Thank you. And thank you, Robin, for being our guest on ANN Television.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you.